You're walking through the streets of Nara, Japan. The year is 737 CE. The city, barely a decade old, was built to be the eternal capital of a great empire. Its wide, grid-patterned avenues were modeled on the grandeur of Tang Dynasty China. Its temples gleam with fresh lacquer and gold leaf. It is, by any measure, one of the most ambitious building projects in Asian history. But the streets are quiet today. Not peaceful quiet, wrong quiet. Doors hang open, rice bowls sit uneaten. In the great halls of government, 4 of the most powerful men in Japan are dead. Brothers, all of them, struck down within weeks of one another. The emperor himself is in mourning, the bureaucracy is in freefall, and across the Japanese archipelago, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the entire population has been wiped from the earth. Welcome to Deadly Outbreaks in History. This is Life Science Channel, and today we're traveling back to 8th century Japan to tell the story of one of the most catastrophic epidemics in the ancient world. A smallpox outbreak so devastating it didn't just kill people, it reshuffled power, reshaped religion, and left scars on Japanese civilization that lasted for centuries. Let's begin. To understand why this epidemic hit Japan so hard, we need to understand what Japan looked like just before it arrived. In 710 CE, the imperial court established a permanent capital at Nara, a city the Japanese called Heijo-kyo, meaning Citadel of Peace. This was a transformative moment. For generations, Japanese capitals had moved whenever an emperor died, partly out of ritual purification beliefs, partly for political reasons. A fixed capital was a statement: we are a centralized, sophisticated state. And the Nara period, running roughly from 710 to 794 CE, really was a golden age of Japanese state building. The government was modeled on the Tang Chinese bureaucratic system, with ministries, ranked officials, land registers, and tax codes. Buddhism was being adopted enthusiastically at the highest levels of society. Poetry flourished. Diplomatic missions sailed back and forth to China and Korea. Japan was, in the eyes of its rulers, ascending. At the center of this system sat the emperor, at this time Emperor Shōmu, who came to the throne in 724. But real political power in Nara, Japan was often exercised not directly by the emperor himself, but by powerful aristocratic families who placed their daughters in the imperial household, produced imperial children, and thereby dominated the court. The most powerful of these families was the Fujiwara clan. And at the height of their power, running the government, controlling appointments, pulling every lever of the state, were 4 brothers of the Fujiwara family: Muchimaru, Fusaki, Umakai, and Maru. These 4 men were, effectively, the engine of the Japanese state. Their father, Fujiwara no Fudito, had spent decades building up Fujiwara dominance. These sons were the culmination of that project. When the smallpox arrived, it killed all 4 of them, within the same year. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about what smallpox actually is and how it got to Japan. Smallpox. The name alone carries a particular dread, even today, even though the disease was officially eradicated in 1980. Caused by the variola virus, smallpox is one of the most lethal infectious diseases in human history. In unvaccinated populations with no prior exposure, it killed somewhere between 20 and 60% of those it infected. Survivors were often left blind or with deeply pitted scars covering their faces and bodies. The disease spreads through respiratory droplets, through the air, through close contact. Once inside the body, the virus incubates silently for 1 to 2 weeks. Then it erupts. Fever spikes, severe back pain hits. The characteristic rash begins, first on the face, then spreading across the entire body. The pustules fill with fluid. In severe cases, they merge together, covering the skin in a single horrifying sheet. Death from smallpox is agonizing, from sepsis, organ failure, respiratory collapse. Now here's the key to understanding the Japanese epidemic. Japan had almost certainly never encountered smallpox before. Smallpox had been devastating populations in China, Korea, and continental Asia for centuries. Those populations, exposed repeatedly over generations, had developed some degree of population-level immunity. Not enough to stop the disease from being terrible, but enough that the worst pandemic-level explosions were rarer. Japan, as an island nation, was relatively isolated. The disease had either never arrived or had appeared only in very limited, contained outbreaks that didn't spread widely. This meant the entire Japanese population in the 730s was essentially immunologically naive, virgin soil, no immunity at all. When smallpox finally arrived in force, it moved through the population like fire through dry wood.
So, how did it get there? The most widely accepted historical account traces the outbreak to travelers arriving from the Korean peninsula, specifically from the kingdom of Silla, which at this time controlled much of Korea. Japan maintained active diplomatic and trade relations with Silla, with ships crossing the Korea Strait regularly. The first recorded cases appeared around 735 CE in northern Kyushu, the southwesternmost of Japan's main islands, and the first landfall for ships arriving from the continent. Kyushu was Japan's gateway to the outside world, and it was here that the disease took root. For a year or so, the epidemic seems to have remained concentrated in Kyushu. This isn't unusual with epidemic disease. Initial outbreaks often simmer in coastal entry points before exploding inland. But Kyushu was not isolated from the rest of Japan. Government officials traveled to and from the capital, tax goods were transported along roads, soldiers were stationed there, and as people moved, the virus moved with them. By 737, smallpox had reached the capital at Nara, and this is where the historical record becomes genuinely extraordinary, because the Japanese state was sophisticated enough and literate enough to actually record what was happening in real time. We have documents from this period, preserved in collections like the Shoku Nihongi, the Chronicles of Japan Continued, that describe the epidemic in stark terms. We have records of prayers offered at shrines, of Buddhist sutras recited to appease whatever divine punishment was being visited upon the land, of government orders that tried and largely failed to manage the crisis. We also have something remarkable: actual population records. Japan had been conducting land surveys and household registers as part of its new Tang-style bureaucracy. While these records are imperfect and incomplete, they allow historians to estimate the demographic toll with more precision than is possible for most ancient epidemics. The estimates are staggering. Japan's population in the early 8th century is estimated at somewhere around 5 to 6 million people. By the time the epidemic burned itself out, roughly by 737 to 738 CE, historians estimate that between 1 million and 2 million people had died. Some estimates go higher. The scholar William Wayne Ferris, who has written extensively on early Japanese demography, suggests the epidemic may have killed somewhere between 25 and 35% of the total population. Let that number sit for a moment. 1 in 3 people, dead in the space of 2 or 3 years. To put this in context, the Black Death in 14th century Europe killed roughly a third of Europe's population over about 6 years. Japan's smallpox epidemic of 735 to 737 achieved a comparable proportional death toll in roughly half the time, and with a disease that, while devastating, is not as acutely lethal as bubonic plague. The difference was complete immunological naivete. Japan had no defenses at all. The death wasn't evenly distributed, of course. Dense urban populations, where people lived in close quarters, suffered the worst. The capital, Nara, with its crowded government halls and temple complexes, was devastated. Rural farming communities, while certainly hit, may have been somewhat cushioned by greater geographic isolation. The agricultural impact was catastrophic. Rice farming in ancient Japan was intensely labor-dependent. Transplanting seedlings, managing irrigation, harvesting, all of it required coordinated human effort. When a third of the workforce died or was incapacitated, rice paddies went untended, crops failed. Famine followed in the epidemic's wake, compounding the mortality and misery in a brutal secondary wave. Government operations collapsed. The elaborate Tang-style bureaucracy the Nara court had worked so hard to build required large numbers of literate officials, a resource that was suddenly terrifyingly scarce. Records from the period show positions going unfilled, provincial governors failing to report, tax collection breaking down. The state didn't disappear, but it staggered badly. And then were the Fujiwara brothers.
Muchimado, Fusasaki, Umakai, Mado. 4 sons of Fujiwara no Fuhito, 4 pillars of the Japanese state. And in the summer and autumn of 737 CE, all 4 of them died of smallpox within months of one another. The deaths were recorded with striking precision in the chronicles. Muchimado, the head of the southern branch, died in the 7th month. Fusasaki of the northern branch died in the 8th month. Umakai of the ceremonial branch died also in the 8th month. Mado of the capital branch died in the 9th month. The speed was almost incomprehensible. Within a single season, the dominant political faction of the Japanese court had been essentially wiped out. The men who ran the ministries, who controlled access to the emperor, who had spent decades consolidating power, gone. The political vacuum was immediate. Into it stepped other factions. Most notably, a man named Tachibana no Moroe rose to prominence, leading the government for much of the late 730s and 740s. But the disruption went deeper than a simple changing of the guard. The entire system of Fujiwara dominance, built by Fujito over a lifetime, had to be rebuilt by the surviving Fujiwara from scratch. It would take generations for them to fully recover their position. There is something almost Shakespearean about this moment. A dynasty at the height of its power, cut down not by a rival, not by a coup, not by war, but by a virus. History offers few cleaner examples of the randomness of biological catastrophe. No amount of political skill, no amount of wealth or influence offered any protection at all. The smallpox did not care who you were. Emperor Shōmu was devastated. Personal grief, political crisis, and, in the cosmology of 8th century Japan, a profound spiritual emergency all arrived simultaneously. In the worldview of Nara, Japan, catastrophes on this scale were not random. They were messages. Divine punishment for sins committed by the state, by the emperor, by the people. The correct response was not just practical, it was intensely spiritual. Shōmu turned to Buddhism with a fervor that would define the rest of his reign. In 741 CE, he issued an edict ordering the construction of provincial temples, kokubunji, in every province across Japan. These temples, staffed by monks who would continuously recite protective sutras, were intended to form a spiritual grid across the country, warding off future divine punishment. But Shōmu's most enduring response to the epidemic came later. The construction of the Todaiji Temple in Nara, and within it, the Daibutsu, the Great Buddha, a colossal bronze statue of the Vairocana Buddha, completed in 752 CE. This statue, 15 meters tall, casting more than 400 tons of bronze, was one of the largest bronze castings in the ancient world. It was explicitly commissioned as an act of national expiation. Japan had sinned, Japan had suffered. The Great Buddha was Japan's apology to the cosmos. Shōmu understood that he was mobilizing the entire economy of the state for this project. The Shoko Ninnogi records his proclamation asking people throughout the country to contribute. Even a single branch of a tree, he said, would be accepted. The project consumed enormous quantities of copper, tin, mercury, charcoal, and human labor. It nearly bankrupted the court, but it was completed. The Todaiji and its Great Buddha still stand today. Every year, millions of tourists visit. Very few of them know they are looking at a monument built in the shadow of one of history's worst epidemics. The epidemic of 735 to 737 left Japan permanently changed in ways that went beyond temples and politics. Demographically, Japan took roughly a century to recover to pre-epidemic population levels. This labor shortage had lasting effects on the land system. The carefully designed Tang-style equal field system, which assigned land to farmers based on household size and taxed them accordingly, began to break down. With so many farmers dead, great aristocratic estates began absorbing land that went unclaimed, planting seeds for the rise of the Shoan estate system that would eventually undermine centralized imperial authority altogether. In other words, the smallpox epidemic of 737 is one of the upstream causes of the transformation of Japan from its Chinese-style centralized empire toward the more decentralized feudal society that would eventually produce the samurai and the shogunate. History is long and causation is complex, but the epidemic absolutely accelerated structural changes that were already beginning to emerge. Intellectually and spiritually, the epidemic deepened Japan's absorption of Buddhism. The Nara period became defined by state Buddhism in a way it might not have been without the trauma of the 730s. Temples, sutras, monks, ritual protection, these became central to how the Japanese state understood its own legitimacy. That spiritual orientation echoed forward into all subsequent periods of Japanese history.
What do we take from all of this? The Japanese smallpox epidemic of 735 to 737 is not as famous as the Black Death or the 1918 influenza, or even the later medieval European plague outbreaks. It happened in a part of the world that was not yet well connected to the broader stream of global historical writing, and it predates widespread literacy by several centuries in many parts of the world. But in terms of proportional devastation, in terms of what it did to a population, a government, a culture, and a dynasty, it belongs in the first rank of historical catastrophes. It reminds us of something that history has to teach us, over and over, and that we seem perpetually reluctant to learn. Civilizations that are isolated from disease pools are not protected from those diseases. They're merely delayed. And when the delay ends, the price is paid in full, with interest. Japan in 735 was a rising, confident, sophisticated state. It had borrowed the best ideas of China. It had built a beautiful capital. Its most powerful family ran the government with precision and ambition. And then a ship docked in Kyushu, and someone coughed. Muchimaro, Fusasaki, Umakai, and Maro are buried in the hills around Nara. The great Buddha still meditates in its wooden hall, enormous and serene, a monument to grief and fear, and the desperate human hope that if we build something grand enough and beautiful enough, perhaps we can appease whatever forces govern this world. The forces, of course, are indifferent. They always have been. But the buildings remain, and so do we. A species that survives by remembering, by recording, and by not looking away from the hard lessons history offers us, even when those lessons come wrapped in suffering. Thanks for listening to Deadly Outbreaks in History. If you found this episode valuable, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with someone who loves history as much as you do. Next time, we'll be traveling to a different continent and a different century. Same darkness, different story. Until then, stay curious and stay well.